Hi, today I want to talk about edge cases and how they can complicate our thinking. When I was younger, like in high school, I saw the world as basically being black and white. That means that everything was either more or less obviously good or bad, right or wrong, and the real question was just making sure we made the right choices in every circumstance. As I've gotten older, like many people, I have begun to see that a lot of things in the world are many shades of gray. That it's not very easy always to divide things up into only two categories. I found myself being less and less able to just say yes or no to something, and that has complicated my life. The difficulties always seem sharpest to me when I'm talking to someone and I see all kinds of complications going on and they don't see that. I find myself wanting to point out these complications and how something that seems obvious at the surface level might have lots of unintended consequences. That's the situation that I'm usually in, although I sometimes have sympathy for people who think that I'm just kind of dithering around and trying to not have the strength of my convictions because it seems so clear to them. While it doesn't happen as often, I am sometimes on the other side of the conversation where somebody else is talking to me and I see things as being very clear, but they don't see them that way. I think that my awareness of this kind of thing came mainly from the few years that I was more or less immersing myself in the major writings in the 20th century on the philosophy of science. Because some thinkers made this very clear to me. Thinkers like Thomas Kuhn argue that we can't really just talk about evidence without talking about a whole background of information against which to judge it. Part of the story of 20th century philosophy of science is that at least some of the categories that we use to make sense out of the world are not as airtight as we once thought they were. The most famous example is that light seems to behave as both a particle and as a wave, something that we thought to be impossible before. The reason why I bring this up is because I think that this blurring of dividing lines affects our thinking in other ways as well. We are becoming more and more aware of edge cases, of situations where there's a dividing line and something comes right up to the edge of that line and it's not 100% clear which side of the line it's on. I've used this idea of an edge case to talk about some of the tensions that we find in the Bible, especially when we have tensions in the details between two or more of the gospel accounts. If we have one of them that we name as being the right one, then we are necessarily saying that all the rest of them are wrong. Take the resurrection sightings. The four Gospels do not agree on exactly which particular people happened to be at the empty tomb. However, they are all agreed that whoever was there first, they were women. They don't agree on exactly all of which women were there, but they all agree that the first people to find the risen Lord were women. If we come to the Bible with the assumption that in order for any of it to be true, absolutely every tiny detail to the smallest amount has to agree with absolutely every other detail across the four gospel accounts, then we are setting ourselves up for failure. It's not that precision isn't valuable, it's just we have to come to terms with the fact that ancient people would not share our commitment to the idea that what really happened is what a video camera would capture if it were set up. And not least because video cameras hadn't been invented yet. Now, we can examine this issue and we can ask the question, who was really there in the first place? And we can look at all the different hypotheses and we can weigh what all the different opinions might be and we can try to analyze what those different explanations might mean for us today. In fact, that's all fine. In fact, I actually encourage people to engage in Bible study in that kind of way. What I worry about is when a legitimate textual question, where something's not as clear as we would like it to be, becomes the basis for a general philosophy of skepticism. Sometimes people want to say, because all four Gospels do not agree on exactly who was all at the empty tomb on Easter morning, therefore nothing they say can be of any value to us whatsoever. Now, on the one hand, that line of thinking can make some kind of sense. If people are divergent on some of the small details like who was at the empty tomb, we might wonder if they may be confused about some bigger details like did the resurrection even happen? However, you can't really get from the one to the other without some more thought and asking some other questions. After all, I remember vividly the day on September 2018 where I was stopped at a stop sign in my car and another car came along and turned the corner too short and ran into me in such a way as to total my car. There is no way that I can be mistaken about this. There are insurance claims and police reports that can corroborate my story, and I can back it all up by the fact that I had to get a new car. But you know what I can't do? I can't tell you what color shirt I was wearing on that day. I know that I was wearing a dress shirt and a tie because that's what I was wearing to preach. I could tell you that it was probably either red or blue or white or gray because those are the colors of the dress shirts that I wore, but I really could not possibly tell you which shirt I was wearing on that day. Does my being fuzzy about details that seem unimportant detract from my certainty about the things that really do matter? Not even remotely. See, the different gospel writers don't necessarily agree on absolutely exactly who happened to be there that morning, but they all agree that whoever was there were women, and they all agree that the tomb was definitely empty. What I'm trying to get at is that the fact that there are edge cases where things aren't always clear doesn't mean that there are no such thing as clear cases. The one doesn't imply the other. Now, someone might argue that as so many of the ways we used to think about things have turned out to be less clear than we thought, and that so many lines are blurry, it might mean that maybe there are no such thing as clear cases. Maybe every case is a fuzzy case. Now, I've heard this in the church from time to time and from a lot of church leaders. It'll sometimes take the form of, do Christians really have to do such and such a thing in order to be a Christian? Or do Christians really have to avoid this other thing in order to be a Christian? Now, in its more responsible and legitimate form, what that's trying to do is get us to ask the question as to whether or not we might be being like those Pharisees who tried to impose our own sense of right and wrong and morality on what God's trying to do. Now, that being said, it is always, or nearly always, possible to wiggle your way out of an absolute statement. I mean, you could ask the question, is sleeping with somebody who is other than your spouse always adultery? Now, on the surface, we'd say, yeah, it is. But I'll bet that if we tried to, we could find some case where it's a little less obvious that that's the case. For example, suppose there was somebody whose spouse seems to have died. All the law enforcement has said that the spouse has died. There's no reason to doubt what the investigation has taken place. So now this person down the line ends up marrying somebody else. And eventually they discover that, in fact, their spouse has not died, but had just run away and made it seem as though they had died. Did that person commit adultery in that case? I mean, we could probably technically make the argument that they committed adultery, but the circumstances are so strange, they're so out of the ordinary that I think most people would have a lot of sympathy for the person, and we probably wouldn't in general treat them as someone who's cheating on their spouse. But the thing is, all that can exist, or at least might exist, but it doesn't excuse someone who's trying to justify themselves having an affair. The fact that something might not be a sin for absolutely everybody at all times and everywhere doesn't mean that it's not sin for you in your life. And that, in the end, is my worry about edge cases. I worry that we're going to start to think that absolutely everything is an edge case when there are at least some things that are not edge cases. I think that while we should be more open to the idea of edge cases, and that we should always be willing to entertain the idea that there's more going on than we realize, I think that we also need to treat our conceptions of things not as definitions of what must be the case, but as guidelines. It's possible that every once in a while our frame of reference will kind of break down, but it will still give us a good guideline for how to live most of our lives. If we treat every situation as if it's an edge case, there's no telling what we might accept in our own lives. I know that I am never more eloquent at pointing out complicating factors than when I've been caught doing something I really shouldn't do, and I want to try to explain why it wasn't wrong for me to do it, even if it would have been wrong if someone else did it. In short, I would urge you to not let the fact that there are edge cases blind you to the fact that there are also clear cases, and that the mere existence of edge cases doesn't get us off the hook if we're in a clear case. Well, that's all for this video. If you have any questions or any topics you'd like me to take up, send me an email at pastorstevik@gmail.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.